So the Gestalt psychologists are going around in Germany, and unfortunately they had to flee Germany to come to the United States because they were Jewish, but they were responding to the structuralists, and a lot of these movements in psychology are in response to what came before. They're saying, you know, you're doing a lot of good things, but you're missing this piece. So they emphasize how you can't break apart consciousness into its pieces. Consciousness is a whole. Consciousness is something that is experienced in terms of wholes and meanings. So Gestalt is roughly translated as whole from the German. And just as a quick example, if you had an image kind of like this, and you erase some of this, okay, and your brain, because you have experiences with triangles and circles, you don't perceive the pieces. You don't have a sensation of a semicircle black line and a straight line and a straight line and a semicircle line. You have a conscious experience of the whole. The Gestaltists would say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, your brain is not like adding all this up, it's just experiencing it. And you experience a triangle and a circle, and you project these kind of wholes onto your experience. That's a little bit about the Gestaltists. Their ideas kind of, unfortunately, don't take a lot of root because when they have to flee Germany, they come to the United States, they don't have research support and university support, and their ideas aren't as well accepted and appreciated in the United States as they were in Europe. Because the structuralists were going on in Europe and the Gestaltists were going on in Europe, they were kind of responding to them. In the United States, it was really about functionalism and behaviorism, which starts to emerge here. Now, Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. He won the Nobel Prize for his amazing work on digestion. He was dissecting dogs, looking at the chemistry as the food breaks down through their bodies, and he really pioneered a lot of techniques, but also came up with some important discoveries. Obviously, he won the Nobel Prize. When he won the Nobel Prize, he gave his laureate speech, and he spoke about his discoveries in psychology. He wasn't a psychologist, but he was saying, look, science is beginning to shed its light on our psychological constitution, and this perhaps is my greatest discovery. What he had discovered was, as you put food on dogs' mouths, of course they salivated. He thought it was more of a reflex. Like the food had to touch their mouths. And like if you hit your knee, then your knee sort of has a reflex. He thought salivation was a reflex. But it was a learned reflex to different stimuli, and that he could find ways of conditioning. Now, in psychology, conditioned is another way of saying learn. Conditioned is a synonym for learn. So Ivan Pavlov learned how to condition dogs to salivate. So he noticed that they'll salivate in anticipation of the food, but if he gave them light before they got the food, he could make them salivate just to the light. And he learned how animals learn, and really how all species can make associations. And this is called classical conditioning. We'll get into that, but he started to look at conditioning here. John Watson builds off of some of Ivan Pavlov's important discoveries and applies it to human beings, and he says these reflexes also apply to things like fear. And he took little baby Albert, they took this famous, it's been a famous study now, but for reasons that it's hard to understand to us today, they took this baby and conditioned this baby to have a terrible fear of white rats. Every time they put a white rat in the lap of little Albert, they banged a metal bar really loud. And poor little Albert started to become afraid of this little white rat. Now, they were doing conditioning, a way of showing how human beings can be shaped by their environment to fear certain things. His fear generalized to other similar stimuli, like things that were white and soft, and it's pretty sad. I actually get sad when I talk about this. But he's trying to show how Freud's ideas about where our fears come from are not legitimate. And he's responding to that, and he's showing you, look, I can show the world with a simple experiment where our fears really come from. And it comes from learning and associations and what the environment does to us. It's not from these repressed fantasies and wishes and parenting and childhood experiences. He's also responding to the structuralists now the structuralists tried to do something called introspection. The structuralists, in order to understand consciousness, they were going inside their minds and trying to describe what they were experiencing, what they were sensing. I smell something, and then I see the red, and then I look at the rose, I see the petals, and so they're trying to break up these pieces of the mind. But this was not an objective process. It was inherently objective. It was not an objective process. It was inherently subjective, right? So it's hard to describe, even though Wilhelm Wundt trained his research assistants and did all sorts of things to try to make it objective. It was a subjective thing. Everyone is different. Everyone has a different experience. And so John Watson's saying, we can't be doing this. We can't be doing psychoanalysis. Really, we can't even focus on consciousness because we can't study it. There's no real scientific way. Again, science is knowledge from sensory observation. How do you sense consciousness? You can't. So we're going to shape psychology to become a behavioral science. He wrote a paper in 1913 called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views it, and it does an effective job of reshaping psychology away from its original emphasis on consciousness to what we can see and observe and do experiments on, because it's trying to be more scientific. And this becomes very popular in the United States for decades, all the way until the 1950s. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior, period. Now you might the scientific study of behavior and mental life or mental events or something like that. No, it was just behavior for many, many years. And people like B.F. Skinner followed John Watson, and here is an operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box, which he was very good at creating gadgets and tinkering. He was a mechanical-minded individual, and so he was able to shape the environment of animals to give them punishments or rewards or different stimuli. And we developed for many years pretty remarkable ways of training and shaping behavior. We have become experts at this, and there's a lot to learn here. I can't wait to talk about it later on in the course. But human beings are not necessarily the same as mice. These mice will do anything for the cheese, especially when they're hungry. And the humanists, after having many years of this focus on animals and running mazes and shaping behavior and looking at all these punishments and consequences and rewards, the humanists come on the scene and they say, there's something that you're missing about human beings. Like I was saying earlier about this kind of stuff. Human beings have this remarkable capacity to make choices, to triumph, to be free, to not eat. I mean, Gandhi didn't eat because the Muslims and the Hindus were at war, and he was almost at death until then the war would stop, and then they'd fight again, and he'd fast some more. And so there's something pretty special about our ability to reason and have morality and all this, and we're missing this. We're missing something about human beings here. So Abraham Maslow talks about our motivations as human beings and the fact that we have basic needs that we can get met, but once those needs are met, we seek to grow and create and develop and improve our world and thrive in ways that cannot be understood by studying animals. Psychology is a human science. It's not a science of animal behavior. We need to study humans, and there's unique things that we're missing here, like our desire to grow. Carl Rogers works with Abraham Maslow. He does more of the therapy side, and he says if you give human beings three things, they will grow. And he's the therapist side of this. Maslow's kind of more into motivation and doing research. Carl Rogers is developing a client-centered therapy or person-centered therapy. Here with psychoanalysis, Freud, or the therapist, was the expert, but here the person themselves is the expert, and he is perhaps the expert in listening and asking questions and helping others to clarify. But what he does is he provides three things: acceptance or unconditional positive regard, meaning that if you just accept people and empathize with them, number two is empathy, and you are authentic or congruent, meaning what you say is incongruent with what you feel, and what you feel is congruent with what you say. You're being true to yourself. You're inviting other people to live their life the same way. And these three things are like sun and water and nutrients for soil, and human beings are like plants, and if you give them these things, they're going to grow. And he really is influential. He influences all forms of modern-day psychotherapy. He influences healthcare and medicine, because these things are pretty darn therapeutic. And they have been shown to really help us psychologically accept ourselves and grow in important ways.